So hello everybody, this is Bhante Joe here, and just here outside of a new kuti they're building on one of the rocks. Actually, in front of me are these kind of houses that they use to spot elephants in their fields. And so I thought to record a Dhamma talk. It's actually Ruvini from TBC had asked about a Dhamma talk. And so one of the topics that had suggested was the uncertainties of life. And so definitely kind of, relating to the current situation with coronavirus and people unsure of how to proceed, unsure what's going to happen next. And remember when I was a few years ago, actually maybe now 5 years ago or so, was in Thailand, and my preceptor had sent me there to do some training in the Thai system. And actually one of the reasons that had become a Theravada monk in the first place was on reading some of these kind of books written by the masters in the Thai forest tradition. I remember I was living at a temple one time. And remember thinking, in the suttas, there's so many arahants all over the place, and had this thought, like, why aren't there any arahants anymore? Remember not long after that, this book arrived. The book was called Patipada, and it was by Longta Mahabua, who was student of Venerable Ajahn Mun. And he, in this book, he described the lifestyle of these forest monks. And actually right after I had this thought, I had a similar thought, well, nobody's achieving the kind of goals that they did in the Buddha's time because nobody's living the way that they did in the Buddha's time. This is, of course, I didn't know much about Buddhism at that time, kind of living in Toronto. But in any event, I remember reading these books and after reading them, thinking, well, these people are living the way that they did in the time of the Buddha, and they're getting the same results that they got in the time of the Buddha. And I remember feeling very inspired by that. And so eventually went to ordain in the Thai forest tradition, possibly with this kind of thinking in mind. And after going to Thailand, kind of here I was in the center of the Thai forest tradition, in the culture that gave rise to it, and the culture that gave rise to these kind of enlightened masters of the modern day. And in this kind of tradition, on arriving there, one of the things that I was struck by, at least, was this kind of incredible emphasis that they put on putting forth effort. There were two things that they would always emphasize, or seemed to always emphasize. One was putting forth effort, and the other one was enduring. And the Thai word for endure is oton, which means basically, kind of endure it, tolerate it, put up with it. And these were the things that got emphasized a lot. There's this phrase in one of the chants that monks often do after the Patimokkha. It's called, I think that's where it is. It's called the Patimokkha Ovada. And there's a line from it which is Kanti Paramang Tapotitika. And that means kanti, or patient endurance, is the highest practice. Paramang, like tapas was was this ancient Indian theory that by doing ascetic practices, you would kind of generate this fire, this like ascetic fire energy. And that fire would, I guess in some cases, give rise to psychic powers. They called that kind of tapas, the kind of heat that's generated by doing austerity. So the Buddha here says, Kanti paramang tapo, which is tapas, titika. So that means like kanti, or patient endurance, is the highest tapas, the highest kind of burning, for burning up defilements, basically. And so this was a phrase that sometimes got repeated, and this seemed to be the kind of emphasis. And then the training there as well was also very much kind of focused on just enduring things. So the monks would have to go pindapad every day, and you had to go in your bare feet, and sometimes it was very cold. You kind of think of Thailand like a warm country, which it is, But it also is it's not like a tropical country. Like here in Sri Lanka, it seems that it's basically always above 25. Even at night, it's been rare that it's gone below 20. But in Thailand, there's times of the year, maybe it's called subtropical or so, when the temperature actually goes down to like 12. And in some places it goes down to even like 6 degrees. And because there's no central heating and people aren't wearing big jackets or anything like that, you're just wearing your usual robes. It can actually be really cold, you feel as cold as in Canada. And so you have to go walking with bare feet in this around, I think the coldest it got there was maybe around like 10 to 13 degrees. And in the morning, that can be really cold, especially after it rains. So there was this kind of emphasis on that. And then there was kind of this schedule where you had to be up at 3 in the morning. You had to be in the sala at 3 in the morning for meditation and chanting. I can't remember exactly how it went. I think it was first maybe 45 minutes of chanting or so, and then afterwards maybe about an hour of meditation. And then immediately after that you went on alms round. And immediately after alms round you came back. There was about an hour break, then you ate your one meal of the day. And in eating this one meal of the day, you as a junior monk, you had to be ready to get the bowl of the senior monk. You had to be ready. When he finished eating, you had to already be down. Monks would be on this large platform. And you had to be hopped down off the platform and then rush to get his bowl before he finished eating. So what that often meant was that your meal of the day was, that was the only meal you could eat. And it was sometimes if you had 20 minutes, if you had an ajahn who ate really slow, that was good. But then sometimes they would rotate. So every 2 weeks, you'd kind of get a new senior monk to take care of. And some of them, as a training, would eat, they eat very fast, like 15 minutes. So that meant you had about 10 minutes to eat for the whole day. And possibly one of the ideas behind it was you had to learn to put up with feelings of hunger and kind of feelings of difficulty. And then similarly, about once a week, the tradition was that monks would stay up all night doing what they called the nesajik, which means not lying down to sleep, but staying up all night practicing meditation, basically staying awake all night. And so in all these ways, this quality of endurance was really emphasized in this Thai forest tradition. This kind of tradition that gave rise to all these great masters. It's kind of interesting as well. I remember the kuttis, they were up on kind of stilts. Like, actually, I can't turn the camera around, but there's actually a kind of a tree house right behind me where people used to look for elephants. But the kuttis were kind of like that, and there would sometimes be these gaps in the floorboard so that cold wind would blow up under there. And so it was kind of, all around your lifestyle became one of austerity, where you were putting up with very difficult conditions very frequently. And possibly one of the reasons for this is because basically when a person is living this way all the time, it turns their mind away from searching for comforts. It turns their mind away from latching on to the things in the world, because basically you're getting by with your base necessities. Your dwelling is the most basic. Your food can be quite basic. The food that one gets on Pindapat. Sometimes you would get like crickets. And this was at a time when Thailand was, I think, much wealthier, when the older generation of monks went. Thailand was actually not as wealthy. And so the food that they got would be even more basic, and possibly the dwellings that they had, especially the salas, the meditation halls, would be even more basic. And one of the things about this is that it did force a person, basically you couldn't become complacent in your external surroundings. You couldn't become too attached to them. It kind of wasn't, maybe not so easy to get attached to your hut, or to get attached to your food, all these various things. And even your companions, like the other monks around you in the monastery, there was a strong kind of encouragement to speak little. So it got summed up in this motto, like eat little, speak little, practice a lot. And what this forced one to do was to turn one to one's own inner resources, because the outer resources were so basic, so minimal, that basically one was left to find happiness, a source of happiness in one's meditation practice. And this was something that's kind of the benefit, I guess you call these kind of Dhutanga practices. These are 13 ascetic practices that the Buddha allowed, including going on alms round, living at the root of a tree, and all these, there's other ones too, living in a cemetery, living in the open air. All these things are meant to create a kind of block, or at least one of the benefits. I certainly can't see all the benefits that the Buddha had in mind, but at least one of them is that one can only go so far in one's efforts to get kind of gratification in the external world. And this is the kind of tradition, again, that gave rise to all these enlightened masters. So this kind of what they would say is that the middle way, the Buddha's middle way, doesn't mean the middle of the pillow. One of the interesting things about this was that a lot of Westerners who came to Thailand would take on these ascetic practices, take on these Dhutanga observances, and a lot of them sometimes ended up getting injuries. So I actually was talking with a monk just the other day, and we were talking about being careful with the ascetic practices, because oh yeah, you got this injury, and talking about kind of the stories of some of the senior monks and how they ended up getting injuries doing these ascetic practices. There's actually this one really interesting, or really kind of funny story. There's one senior monk in Wat Pah Pong, actually is kind of was the monk who I ordained with, and he had this story about how when he went there, he would start doing, I think, the sitter's practice, which is basically you don't lie down to sleep. And he would always sit in the full lotus position. But his character wasn't, his constitution wasn't well suited to this not lying down to sleep. And so when he didn't get enough sleep, he tended to have these seizures. And so at this one point, he had this seizure, and he started to bite off his tongue. Because it was in the middle of the sala with all the monks. He was just not sleeping enough. And so luckily one of the monks there was a former army vet, and he knew what to do in these situations. So he kind of grabbed his belt and folded it in half and stuck it between his teeth so that he wouldn't bite his tongue off while he was having the seizure. And so they took him to the hospital after that, and I guess got stitched up, got his tongue stitched up. And as he was coming out of the hospital, he saw Ajahn Chah there saying, and Ajahn Chah was there sipping the Coke, and he said, "Hey, take it easy." You're kind of paraphrasing here. Kind of to give him a lesson that, one can go too far with these ascetic practices. And these things, have lessons for the current situation with coronavirus right now. And one of the lessons that one can take potentially from these Thai masters, from their training, is that that one of the qualities that when one tries to solve a solution, tries to solve a problem using every other means, and maybe using other means, the normal means, and it doesn't work, then one of the qualities that one can turn one's mind towards is endurance. There are these difficult situations that arise in a person's life. There are situations that are out of control, are situations that are unpleasant, where usually people get their comfort, get their meaning in life from these certain external things. Those kind of external things get taken away, and it's a big shock, a big difficulty, kind of be a big imposition that can cause a lot of suffering. So when this kind of thing happens, one of the ways that we can deal with it is through this quality of endurance. Kind of endurance isn't something that often hear about too much as a kind of way necessarily to deal with difficult situations, and this is possibly, maybe hear about it sometimes, and certainly can be a respected quality in certain situations, certain cases in the modern day. But at least for myself, know that one of the things growing up in the modern era is that it's been a wonderful time to basically be alive and be a human. There's an unprecedented level. Possibly the entire world right now is possibly the richest that it's been in recorded human history. Technology is at its apex. A few months ago, I just flew over to Sri Lanka. It took 2 days There's generally a lot of food for everybody. Generally, again, the world is peaceful. I mean, there are wars, but nothing like there was in the past. And so there hasn't really been so much of a need, at least compared to past generations, that, looking back at what I've seen for myself growing up, is there hasn't been as much of a need to rely on this quality of endurance. And kind of most things that one wants are easily available at one's fingertips. I actually remember being a young man, and when I was young, The Simpsons first came out. I don't even know if The Simpsons may still be on the air. I'm not too sure. But I loved The Simpsons as a young man, and used to kind of wait. It was on Thursdays, I think, Thursday nights at that time. And I used to just wait every Thursday till The Simpsons kind of came on, and loved to watch it. And I had this thought, back when I was young, wouldn't it be great, because they would sometimes do these reruns where they play an episode you'd already seen. And I had this thought, wouldn't it be great if you could see any episode of The Simpsons you wanted, kind of any time? And now, of course, you can do that. You can watch a whole 10 seasons of The Simpsons, or a whole 10 seasons of, or whatever, any show. You can watch a bunch of, you can just watch whatever episode you want at whatever time you want, however long you want. You can pause it in the middle of the episode. That was another thing. They used to have these commercial breaks that maybe they still have them on the internet. I don't know, but it used to be like a half-hour show would be like 20 minutes, and there'd be breaks with these commercials in between it. And so now you can just skip all the commercials and watch it right away. So the world has become kind of increasingly convenient. I kind of compare that to a time when, my grandfather used to tell me stories about his life. And when they first came over, he was the first generation of Canadians. My great-grandfather came over from Germany, though I don't look German necessarily. I'm part German. Got a part German and part African, but my great-grandfather on my mother's side came over from Germany. And when they described what it was like back then, it seemed like a really rough kind of existence. So my grandfather used to do work with my great-grandfather. And he said in Canada at that time, all the forests were really, huge. They'd have huge trees. You could take, he said he took two guys, I think, to wrap your arms around. One guy standing on one side, one on the other. And they didn't have kind of chainsaws to use, so they would cut this firewood for people with a big two-handled saw. And he said that at the end of the day, they would actually get paid in firewood. It was kind of maybe at the end of the day, but their pay, it sounds like they didn't necessarily get money. They got firewood that they'd cut. They just were able to get it because they cut off that guy's land. And he said as well that, living then, you were kind of very poor. Nowadays there's these central heating systems, and they heat up a whole house, no problem. But he said, I think then you had a wood stove, might be in a central room. And he said they would wake up in the winters and there'd be snow on his blanket, from the snow that kind of got in through the walls or through the cracks in the walls or something like that. And then he said as well, there was no running water. So in the winter, you would get to bathe maybe once a week, and there was more children then. He said, I think he had 9 siblings, or there were 9 of them all together, something like that. And he said all the little ones would go first. So by the time it was the end, him and the older men would go, him and his father would go last, and the water would be kind of very, very muddy. So it had this kind of quality that could see that in his eyes, or at least in that generation, just by being alive, one had to endure, one had to put up. And he said often sometimes they wouldn't have much food, so but still his mother would kind of cook this soup, I guess made from stuff they got. And if they saw a traveler coming along the road, they would offer them some soup. So just being alive in this kind of generation, one had to have this quality of endurance, this quality of being able to bear with difficult things, difficult situations. And again, it's not necessarily like you would go and deliberately live that way, again. But one of the things about the capacity of the mind is that when a person practices this endurance, then things that seem difficult become less so. And kind of the more one practices enduring, the painful feelings that come can be less, can lessen just by one's getting used to them. So remember, as a young child, kind of growing up, So I remember one time I asked to cut some vegetables or something, and I ended up cutting my finger, and I was just so appalled, kind of saw all this blood. It was like maybe up in that point in my life, it was the worst wound that I inflicted upon myself, and all this blood came out of my hand. And I just started screaming, and of course you don't have an idea of the consequences then. And of course later in life you end up going through the woods or whatever, and you'll have a cut and you won't even know that you're bleeding. And part of this is because of the development of this capacity of endurance. This kind of part of it is because one's kind of mental ability to tolerate pain becomes greater. And with this greater tolerance of pain, the suffering that one has from pain becomes less. So this is also the way that it can be for people in their lives. In that generation, in my grandfather's generation, there was quite a lot of kind of uncertainty. Actually, his older brother got killed in World War II. And they also, not long before that, they had the Great Depression. And I think they also had, they had World War I in that time too. So because of these situations, the lifestyle that those people led, some of the things that they did, and their capacity to bear up with that uncertainty was actually really great. Kind of, I myself had always been impressed with that particular generation, with the strength of that generation. And this is not to put down the way things are now. That generation worked very hard, and as a result, we had a very nice life in my generation. But one of the things about life is that it's inherently uncertain. So the Buddha always teaches about this. It's kind of one of the main tenets in Buddhism is that, there's this uncertainty to life. There's this impermanence to life. Life is anicca. It's kind of anicca in the Pali means like stable. Like you get this image, one of the monks who's very good at Pali gives this image of like a stable chair. Like that chair is, at least as far as I remember, that's the image he gives. But that chair, with 4 legs is stable. You can rest on it. But if you maybe take out 2 of those legs, the chair becomes, very wobbly. I mean, you can sit on it, but, a wrong move and it topples. And this is the way that it is with the conditions in a person's life. Always, as a result of the nature of the world, these conditions are unstable. They're anicca. They kind of aren't something that we can necessarily put our full weight on. One of the tricky things about it is that when these conditions seem stable, that's when one goes out to rest all of one's weight on these conditions. That's when one goes to sit down on them, put all their weight on them. And when they do, sometimes those conditions change and become wobbly, and it can generate a lot of fear, generate a lot of unpleasantness. So, the world for a long time has been in a state of unprecedented peace. And kind of, at least since, or maybe not unprecedented, but, to a great extent, there haven't been the wars that there have been in the past. So kind of study ancient history, even history of the Middle Ages, or history of Roman times, history of ancient India, history of Sri Lanka. There's these times when people invade and just enslave huge numbers of people, or there'll be a famine as a result of wars, which kills huge number of people. Even the diseases then, actually just yesterday was reading about the bubonic plague, kind of how does this compare? And they had another one, the Spanish flu, what were the responses then in a time of pandemic and what happened to people? And this is the way it's been throughout history. There have been these times when disease comes and just levels a human population. There have been these times when war comes and destroys a large portion of the population. There have been times when famine comes, lack of food, and destroys a large portion of the population. And in my lifetime, at least, none of those things to a really large extent, to the extent that they've happened in historical times, not to say they haven't existed at all, but to the extent that they have existed in the past, it hasn't seemed as large of a concern. So for this reason, when something like this comes, when coronavirus comes, or governments start to shut down schools or impose lockdowns, it can generate a lot of fear, a lot of fear about the future, a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen, a lot of worry about how things will be with my kids, with whatever it might be. And some of these worries can be legitimate, and we have to plan for the future. We have to look at the way things are going to be, and we have to make reasoned choices to try to do the best we can. But the Buddha's teachings tend to point us in a different direction. Rather than solely, I mean, we do our best to try to fix situations so that they go well. But rather than solely looking at that, his teachings point us back to look at our own minds, to look at the way it searches for stability in external situations. So one of the things about this kind of search for stability in external situations is that it creates this kind of illusion of nicha, of permanence. The world is stable for so long, then one starts to project onto that stability. Wait a minute, in 5 years I'm going to do this, in 10 years I'm going to do this, in 20 years I'm going to do this, And it seems like a reasonable plan. It can even sometimes seem like something that one deserves. Like, I deserve to have this, I planned for this, I prepared for this, This is the way it's going to be for me, this is the way it's going to be for the country I live in, this is the way it'll be for my kids. And all of this is based on what one can see right now. If the world seems stable at the present time, it becomes easy to project that stability into the future, so that in the future the world will be stable, or always should be stable. When the world seems unstable at the present time, then it can become easy to project that instability into the future, so that, things will only get worse. But the truth of these things is that all of them are a bit uncertain. The world goes through both times of stability and times of instability. It goes through both times of plenty and times of famine. And despite whatever modern technology people can come up with, this is a fundamental truth of human existence, that it's anicca. So the Buddha's solution for this isn't just in trying to manipulate the conditions so that they're as good as we can make them. I mean, that is something that we can do, and of course is reasonable to do. Reasonable to try to find a vaccine for the coronavirus, reasonable to, take public health measures. People study these things for long periods of time, have studied past pandemics and know what to do about that. But one of the things about the Buddha's teachings is that there's a limit to the abilities of humans to manipulate their conditions. All these things depend on a set of underlying conditions. When those underlying conditions change, then all our ability to manipulate the conditions changes. And this is something that's inevitable. So this is why in our meditation practice, when people practice meditation, this is one of the meditations that maybe is not so popular in the West right now, but is learning to turn one's mind to the perception of impermanence over and over again. The perception that these things don't last, the perception that they're uncertain, the perception that they're unstable. One of the reasons why people don't like to look, or why it can be unpleasant to look at things in this way, is because when one's put a lot of one's weight on these pleasant things, to think of having them taken away can leave a person feeling bewildered, can leave a person feeling adrift. But the benefit of having these kind of meditations in mind is that when things do go badly, one can at least be mentally prepared for them. Not mentally prepared in a pessimistic way, like, I knew this was going to happen, but one can mentally prepare for them because in cultivating these meditations correctly, it leads to detachment. It leads to a dispassion for the things that one sets one's mind on. And this dispassion, this kind of detachment, this kind of cultivation leads one to a search. It leads one to a search for something that's truly stable. So this is the way it was the part of the way that the training was structured in Thailand. You couldn't rely on these kind of external things, so you look to your own internal resources. Because the Buddha's teachings are like that, there's kind of this teaching of the two arrows. You can be struck by these painful bodily feelings, painful verbal things. That's one arrow, but there's a second arrow that gets struck, which is the mental arrow. It's kind of, you get shot with one arrow and then you shoot again, this kind of mental arrow. And the mental arrow is, in the Buddhist teachings, seen by far the worst. This is the one where dukkha comes from. It's kind of dukkha comes from this mental arrow, from one's kind of the way one amplifies suffering, the way one attaches to suffering, the way one sorrows when things change in a way that one doesn't like. So this is the benefit of having this perception of impermanence, the instability, the uncertainty of life, the uncertainty of external things is that it prepares one's mind for situations like this. And in preparing one's mind for situations like this, when times get good, one learns not to rush out, to put all one's weight on those times. When times get bad, one learns not to rush out, to put one's weight on all the bad things. And what this helps to do is stop a lot of the kind of proliferation that comes from these things. So we actually had this kind of Dhamma discussion the other day with a senior monk who's here, kind of very respected senior monk. And there's one term that had kind of confused me for a while, and has been given a very good definition by some of our leading senior monks, is kind of this term papancha. And generally this term, one good definition for it is objectification. In other words, papancha means you kind of, it starts from this root, I am the thinker, and then from there goes on, okay, I'm a thinker, it turns me into an object, turns all these other things to an object. And what papancha meant in ancient India was it was basically this kind of, apparently this embroidering of a theme. So, you would have like a central theme in Indian music, like maybe a happy theme or whatever, and then the musician would kind of embroider it. They would embellish the theme. They would flesh it out. So this senior monk said to me that a good kind of definition for papancha, or one of the things that in some contexts said to the person who asked the question, not me rather, was that one potential good definition for papancha, excuse me, was expansion. In other words, one takes and keeps expanding on it, keeps going outwards, keeps embroidering this theme. So when one keeps this perception of impermanence in mind constantly, it helps to avoid this expansion. So for example, when times are good, when things are good, one sets up a sense of oneself or one's identity in that time when things are good and papanchas it. Kind of one can embroider that theme so that the theme goes outwards. Okay, things are good now, this is the way it'll be in the future, the government's like this is the way the government will be in the future, this is the way it'll be for me in the future, this is the way it'll be for my kids in the future. And there's this kind of expansion. This kind of papancha, create this embroidering of this theme, of this idea of the way that things will be when times are good. And similarly, when times are bad, there can be this papancha around the way things are. Oh, wait a minute, there's a virus now, maybe, 10% of the world's population will die, or maybe however much it'll be, and this is another type of papancha. This is an embroidering of the theme, embroidering of this kind of worry. Oh, times are bad, so out it goes, It's kind of what you might call this kind of delusion papancha, this papancha based on an idea of things that may or may not come to pass. So Ajahn Chah's kind of his word he used to like to use instead of anicca was maine, which means not certain. Things are uncertain. They don't have a certain kind of definite way that they're just going to be all the time. So because of this uncertainty, although external things are uncertain, people can turn their attention to find a refuge inside that's more certain, something that's more lasting, something that's more resilient. But the tricky thing about finding this internal refuge is that one has to become dispassionate towards external conditions to find it. So again, just thinking about this Simpsons episode, we kind of were talking a little bit about the Simpsons earlier. There was this episode of the Simpsons where I think Homer or something like that, I think he's on a bridge. I can't remember exactly how it went, but he's on this bridge. And he ends up kind of sticking his hand into some machinery on the bridge. and the people keep trying to get him out of, I think it's on a bridge. I can't remember what it was. But anyways, he's got his hand stuck in some machinery. And people keep trying to get him out. And then it cuts to the scene where it's like, okay, Homer, we're going to have to saw your arm off. And then at the end of the scene, it comes to be a kind of, wait a minute, Homer, are you just holding on to this piece of thing? And he's like, yeah. And so then everybody starts laughing. He lets go of whatever piece of machinery he was holding on to in there, and doesn't have to have his arm sawed off. And so in a similar way, a lot of the kind of suffering that one generates for oneself is because one holds on to these kind of embroidered themes. One holds on to the theme that gets embroidered when times are good. one holds on to the themes that gets embroidered when times are bad. And as long as one is holding on, one can't let go and find anything better. So this is why in a situation, the Buddha kind of recommends all the time this cultivation of impermanence. Because this impermanence leads one to direct one's mind away from external things, direct one's mind away from the things that one usually puts one's weight on, direct one's mind away from one's family, from one's friends, from one's job, from one's career, from one's reputation, from one's health, from one's body, from one's physical appearance. All these things are things that people usually put their weight on. They're what people usually embroider the theme of papancha with. They're what people usually set their expectations for the future on. And when these expectations aren't met, that's when they suffer. But when we cultivate this perception of the impermanence of life, the impermanence of basically everything, it lets us let go of that rod, like in Homer's case, so that if the machine comes by, it doesn't have to kind of saw a person's arm off. You can just go freely wherever you want. But in letting go of this, although it can be kind of unpleasant at first, one learns to turn and look for a refuge more inside. One learns to turn and look for a refuge in the Dhamma, learns to turn and look for a refuge in one's practice, and one learns to trust less in the papancha, in the expansion, in the embroidering of these themes. Because basically one of the Buddha's teachings is that all that a person needs to be happy is already right here. And kind of even at a person's death, even in a time of sickness, even if a person's in great pain, it's still possible for a person to be happy in the face of that. And this is because there's these two arrows to the pain. There's the arrow that one gets shot with, that's the pain itself, and there's the second arrow that one shoots oneself with, which is the kind of proliferation, I guess you call it, around the pain, or the attachment to the things that cause the pain. This is what causes dukkha. This is what causes suffering. So in our practice, what we learn to do is to turn our mind more towards things that are more stable. Just check my time, make sure I'm not going. We learn to turn our minds more towards generosity, to this aspect of giving. The Buddha says even if it was one's last bite, one's last meal, one wouldn't give without having shared if they knew the results of giving as he knows. And this giving can give a person quite a lot of happiness, even in a time of coronavirus, even in a time when people are in social isolation. There's still ways that a person can give. There's still ways that a person can do good things for their fellow people. I think I heard recently about somebody who was going around, people have probably heard all this more than me, but was putting slips into the doors of maybe like elderly people and saying, if you need any help with groceries, if you need any help, then let me know. And even just that is a way of giving that can ease a lot of fears in one's fellow citizens, people in the neighborhood. One can give. Nowadays is the era of online kind of interactions, and in one's interactions online, one can give. One can give kind of happiness to other people. People, if one knows somebody who might, in a time like coronavirus, might be feeling a little isolated, one can reach out to that person online, even if they're living thousands of miles away, send them a message to see how they're doing. And of course, one can give to the people in one's own home, people in one's own community, various ways. There's all these many ways that one can give. One can give through one's practice of metta. This practice of giving is something that gives one a basis that's separate from the attachment, from the consumption that one might usually have to the world. It's something that gives one a happiness apart from that. It's something that gives one a happiness that's very lasting, that's very meaningful. There's this kind of way of training the mind. There's also this way of training the mind through morality, so that one doesn't break any precepts, regardless of what the external situation might be. So, even in a time of kind of famine, if one is a Buddhist, if the coronavirus spreads, then one doesn't go out and kill animals to eat them up in that time. One wouldn't kind of go and lie to try to get, say, more supplies. I don't think it's at that point or anything yet. One wouldn't steal to get supplies for oneself. And what all this helps to do is to detach one's mind from one's attachments to the things that usually give life meaning. It even helps to detach one's mind from life itself, in the sense that these things, these values, these internal qualities become even more important for a person than saving their own life. When that happens, then a person gains this refuge that's much more true, and it gives one the space needed, letting go of this kind of handle, gives one the dispassion needed to turn one's mind inwards towards meditation. And this is the third way that one can cultivate these happiness in one's life. And meditation, the nice thing about cultivating it is that it doesn't require anything from a person except that they basically be conscious enough to meditate. Even if a person's starving, they can meditate. Even if a person is dying, they can meditate. Even if everything else has gone wrong in a person's life, they can meditate. And this meditation is founded on this morality. It's founded on this generosity. These three things kind of come together and build on each other in a kind of virtuous cycle. So this kind of thing with meditation is that one can find feelings of happiness in one's meditation that outstrip the usual feelings of happiness that one might feel in the world. One can generate this ease so that, basically one raises the level of one's mind bit by bit, day by day, month by month, year by year, until one's level of happiness is higher on a general level than it used to be. One's level of ease is higher on a general level than it used to be. One's level of contentment is higher on a general level than it used to be. But all these things are aimed, this is the usual types of meditation that bring a type of ease, but these things are actually aimed at a higher purpose, and that higher purpose is actually to develop this dispassion. Because life is always this way. Whether there's a coronavirus, whether there's no coronavirus, these things are actually joined together. As the Buddha's teachings on the 8 worldly winds is that gain and loss follow, the world runs after them. These things basically are kind of joined together. Wherever there's gain, eventually there's loss. Wherever there's loss, there can eventually be gain. It's not permanent. Gain doesn't just last forever. Loss doesn't just last forever. Wherever there's pleasure, eventually there's pain. Wherever there's pain, eventually there's pleasure. Wherever there's status, eventually there's loss of status. Wherever there's loss of status, eventually status comes. And wherever there's praise, eventually there's blame. Wherever there's blame, eventually praise comes. These things, in a sense, give the conditions for the other one to rise. So when one learns to contemplate the impermanence of life in this way, one stops seeing life necessarily as either being a theme that's going to be 100% good all the time, or a theme being 100% bad all the time. It starts to be like, so for example, if things are going well, the government will be this way, or whatever it might be, or things are going badly, situation's going to escalate, maybe a whole bunch of people are going to die, we don't know. But the thing about this in a general sense is that when one cultivates this meditation on impermanence, one can learn to see these things as a whole. In other words, it's like kind of looking at a snake. The snake has this dangerous portion, its head, and not dangerous portion, its tail. But they're both connected. They're both the same snake. In the same way, pleasure and pain are both part of the same thing. Gain and loss, both part of the same thing. Fame and anonymity, both part of the same thing. There's no attaching to something without suffering when it goes. This is the principle behind attachment, behind clinging, behind upadana. And it's this clinging that leads people to become a husband, to become a wife, to become a teacher, to become whatever identity it is, and then when the underlying conditions change, they suffer. So the ultimate aim of the Buddha's teachings is to develop this dispassion for the sake of cutting one's attachment to these things permanently, towards cutting one's desire, towards cutting one's craving, because it's this craving that causes one to suffer. It's this craving that leads one to get shot with the second arrow. It's this craving that leads to dukkha, that leads to all the various forms of pain, that leads to this papancha, this spreading outwards where we feel pain in all these various ways. It has a root, and this root can be cut at the root, can be cut at craving. So we can learn to do this through constantly cultivating this perception of impermanence. This turns our mind away from the world, turns our mind from launching out to the world, turns our mind from becoming enmeshed in the world, And if we can cut the fetters that bind us to the world, then our mind, to use Ajahn Chah's simile, tends to become more like oil and water. In other words, the suffering that one experiences is like this water. The mind is more like oil, and the two don't mix. And it's in this way, through this cultivation, through this perception of impermanence, through this perception of the non-lasting nature of life, through the perception of these 8 worldly winds, that gain and loss, pleasure and pain, praise and blame, fame and anonymity, these things are connected. It's through the cutting of the cord to these things that one finds ease, that one's mind can be at ease. And we don't know, the epidemic may get worse or may get much better. Actually, probability-wise, this doesn't look to be on the level of the bubonic plague or anything terrible, but who knows? But regardless of whether the coronavirus escalates or de-escalates, regardless of whether the economic situations become great, become poor, regardless of whether we feel pleasure or pain, for a person who achieves this dispassion, for a person who achieves the cutting of their fetters, they're happy regardless of the situation. They're happy regardless of what happens. And this is a happiness that if people gain it, the Buddha's teachings, they don't have to do anything to maintain it. It's right here that the world ends. It's right here that our attachment to the world ends. It's right here that our suffering ends, here inside of our minds, when we learn to cut our fetters. So this is the potential, this recollection of impermanence. It can lead us to this dispassion, even if we're not there yet, even cultivating it in a time of coronavirus. Once the coronavirus ends, remembering, wait a minute, there was this coronavirus. When things get good again, remembering, wait a minute, things can change. One doesn't attach to the good times. When times get bad, remembering, wait a minute, things can change. One doesn't get attached to the bad times. One learns to look more and more to a refuge in the Buddha's teachings. Because this is the refuge that's true. This is the refuge that's supreme. That is a refuge in the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. That is a refuge in his teachings. That is finding the true refuge that one can find when one cuts one's fetters, when one cuts one's attachments to the world, and one cuts the pain that comes from attachment to the world. When one finds this ease that doesn't change. And this is the ultimate refuge. There's no thing that's better or higher than that. Okay, so leave that for reflection, and hope that everybody in Toronto, everybody at the TBC has a great day, corona-free day. Wishing you all the best. Until next time.